The ledger hit the podium with a sound like a door closing on something old. It was small, cracked, bound in leather that had gone the color of dried clay, and in an amphitheater where the cheapest holographic array cost more than a colony ship, it was the most wrong thing in the room. Security adjudicator Wren noticed it the moment Dr. Aris Thorne set it down. His trifocal optical clusters swept it once, then swept it again, because his verification protocols were calibrated to register anomalies, and the cracked leather notebook sitting on her podium registered as exactly that. Not a threat, not a weapon, just a thing that should not be here and was. She pushed her wire-framed glasses up her nose, did not look at Subdirector Vaylock. Vaylock was already talking. A species that discovered faster-than-light travel last week, he said, and his secondary breathing vents flared wide, filling another half-meter of air with his silhouette, has no business auditing the mathematics of the ancients. The chamber held 412 accredited delegates. Wren watched 11 of them write the line down. None of them looked at the human. If they had, they might have noticed she was still chewing the last of her breakfast. Stay close. What she does next, I still don't have a category for it. 6 hours earlier, Wren had been doing what he always did before a full session of the Apex Concordat, running the intake sweep, logging credentials, watching the gravitational dampeners rise and fall as delegates climbed to their assigned tiers. The higher the tier, the more standing you carried. The more standing, the more the dampeners worked for you, amplifying posture, steadying breath, making the body read as calm and enormous even when it wasn't. He had been an adjudicator for 19 years. He had verified credentials for species that breathed sulfur, for ambassadors who communicated entirely in ultraviolet pulse, for one legendary session where a Vorath delegation had arrived in a ship the size of a small moon and apologized for parking it too close to the hub's eastern sensor array. He had never seen anyone arrive with a notebook. The hub itself occupied a fixed point above the Concordat's primary relay station, a crystalline structure 300 meters across, whose outer shell refracted light into the precise spectrum that conveyed neutrality across the 12 dominant visual ranges of its member species. From the outside, it looked like a held breath. From the inside, it looked like a courtroom and felt like a knife. Every surface angled toward the central data stream, a column of live holographic light, 40 meters tall, where the session's official record wrote itself in real time. Whatever landed in that column, all 412 delegates could see. Whatever landed in that column became true for purposes of the session record, unless Wren's verification protocols flagged it first. That was his job, notice the wrong things. Subdirector Vaylock of the Crinian Hegemony had arrived 2 hours before the session opened. He came with an entourage of 9 aides, 3 portable holographic arrays, and a proposal document that Wren's intake system clocked at 312 pages. Vaylock himself was tall even by Crinian standards, his dermal plating a deep arterial blue that shifted toward black at the shoulder joints when he was pleased with himself. He had been pleased with himself since he walked through the outer airlock. His secondary vents, the secondary set, which in Crinians served no respiratory function but a great deal of social one, cycled through a slow expansion and contraction that Wren had learned, over years, to read as the biological equivalent of a man cracking his knuckles before a card game he had already decided he would win. Vaylock placed his arrays at the 3 highest available tier points and spent 40 minutes adjusting their projection angles. Wren ran the standard tamper check on each one. The hub's digital tampering field detectors were calibrated to catch live data manipulation attempts, and hegemony arrays had flagged before on technicalities, but the sweep came back clean. He logged them as compliant and moved on. Dr. Aris Thorne arrived at the session gate 7 minutes before the opening bell. She had cleared intake 3 days earlier, her credentials filed through Earth's Office of Trade Accountability, an institution Wren had never heard of before this session and had spent 2 hours the previous evening researching, finding almost nothing, which was the first thing that had made his optical clusters twitch. She was shorter than he expected, lacking any dermal plating, no threat display adaptations that his scanner could register. She wore a plain dark suit, not the formal session robes most delegates chose, and a pair of wire-framed glasses that appeared to be made of actual metal and actual glass, which struck him as a remarkable choice in an era of direct optic correction. She carried one item, the leather-bound ledger cracked along the spine. His intake system could not classify it as a device. It was analog, ink and paper, and a binding that had been repaired at least twice. He flagged it in his notes as an unclassifiable object and let her through. She thanked him. Ren realized later that she was the only delegate who had. The session opened. 412 delegates found their tiers. The central data stream came alive in a column of shifting light. Veylock took the highest available podium, the tier reserved for primary presenters, where the dampeners were strongest and the angles were designed to make whoever stood there look, to every optical system in the room, slightly larger than they were. Aris Thorne took a mid-tier seat, not the lowest. The Concordat had assigned her a position commensurate with Earth's current standing, which was described in its intake documentation as emerging observer-adjacent. Not the highest, somewhere in the middle, where the dampeners were neutral, neither working for her nor against her. She set the ledger on her desk, opened it to a page near the front, took out a pen. An actual pen. 3 delegates in Ren's field of view turned to look. Veylock did not look. He was already building his arrays into a unified projection scaffold, turning the central data stream into a layered display, his 312 pages spreading out in stacked holographic sheets, color-coded by section. It was, from a pure technical standpoint, impressive. Ren had run sessions with full hegemony delegations before. They brought resources like weather systems. The thing Veylock had built above the central floor was the size of a small building and had clearly taken weeks to assemble. Aris uncapped her pen. The Concordat's presiding officer, a Velhari senior delegate named Morris, whose species registered authority through the precise angle of their crest feathers, called the session to formal order, and Veylock began. He was, Ren would acknowledge, a skilled speaker. He opened with a 17-minute summary of the Crinian hegemony's 2 centuries of trade dominance, the 400 systems, the route networks, the stabilization of freight corridors that had kept 8 emerging species from resource collapse. He cited figures with the ease of a man citing the color of the sky. He moved through the history of the trade, cipher the way a lawyer moves through a closing statement. Nothing hurried, nothing doubted. The architecture of a man who had never had to prove himself to a room because the room had always already believed him. Then he introduced the amendment. 37%. That was the tariff rate embedded on page 4 of his proposal. A 37% levy on all freight transiting the hegemony's established corridors, applied to every species categorized as emerging or observer-adjacent, which, under current Concordat classification, included 11 species. The amendment framed it as a corridor maintenance fee. The framing was, technically, legal under legacy deference, which allowed established trade powers to set their own maintenance rates without requiring a line-item audit from newer member species. It was, Ren calculated quietly, the largest single proposed rate increase in the Concordat's history. He ran the figure through his economic impact models. The result came back as a column of red. At 37%, 4 of the 11 affected species would reach resource critical within 8 years. Veylock's vents flared as he presented it. He was proud. He was allowed to be proud. Nobody was going to stop him. He turned then to the floor, to the assembled delegates, and his gaze, the deliberate, sweeping gaze of a Crinian in full authority display, moved across the tiers and stopped on Aris Thorne, who was writing something in her ledger. I must address, Veylock said, and his vents pushed wider, the matter of Earth's observer delegation. The room went still. Ren's clusters held on Aris. She did not look up. A species that discovered faster-than-light travel last week, Veylock said, and the contempt was not performed, Ren noted. It was structural, the way a Crinian senior might speak to a child who had wandered into a negotiation and sat down, has no business auditing the mathematics of the ancients. the cognitive architecture required to engage meaningfully with legacy trade frameworks develops over centuries, not decades. I would ask the presiding officer to note, for the record, that Earth's observer status does not carry voting rights on amendments of this complexity. Legacy deference applies. The vote should proceed. 11 delegates wrote it down. The presiding officer's crest angled toward the floor in the Velhari expression that Ren had learned meant, "I have to acknowledge this, and I will, and I'm sorry." Aris Thorne set her pen down. She looked up. She pushed her glasses up her nose with one finger, not a gesture of nerves, Ren thought, watching her, more like a person picking up a tool they'd set aside for a moment. "Subdirector," she said, her voice was even, clear. The translator rendered it without inflection, which Ren suspected was accurate. The ancients clearly forgot to carry the 4. Let's review line 72. The chamber did not go silent. It went something worse than silent. It went a particular quality of very still that Ren had only heard once before, when a Velhari senior had produced, in the middle of a routine freight dispute, the original signed copy of the Concordat's founding charter with 17 forged seals highlighted in red. Veiloc's vents closed to half-width. "This is not the time for..." Line 72, Aris said again. She had not raised her voice. She was already looking back down at her ledger. "Your corridor maintenance equation, the freight volume variable, you've used a linear progression model." She turned a page. Linear models don't account for nebula boundary freight rerouting. They haven't, technically, since the Solhari correction. That was, she glanced up briefly, not at Veloc, but at the central data stream, about a century and a half before I was born. She paused. "Before my planet was born, actually, so I take your point about the mathematics of the ancients. I just want to make sure we're using the correct ones." Ren's optical clusters swept to Veloc. The secondary vents had stopped moving entirely. Veloc recovered in under 3 seconds. Ren had seen Crinian senior diplomats recover from worse, from data breach announcements, from floor challenges by species twice their size, from one session where a live feed had broadcast a private channel conversation to all 400 attending delegates, and the senior involved had simply kept talking as though the universe had agreed with him. They were built for composure. Their biology gave them tools for it. The secondary vents that could project calm, the dermal plating that showed nothing, the bone structure around the jaw that kept the lower face still even when the upper was processing at full speed. Veloc straightened. His vents cycled back to their full-open position. "Legacy deference," he said, addressing the presiding officer rather than Aris, "exists for a reason. The Solhari correction is a 700-page supplementary document to the original freight framework. Its application to corridor maintenance calculations is a matter of significant interpretive debate among qualified trade scholars. I would not expect an observer-adjacent delegation to be conversant with its nuances." He glanced at Aris. One glance. Quick and dismissive as closing a tab. "Shall we proceed to the vote?" It was not a question. Presiding Officer Morris turned toward Aris's tier. His crest feathers were angled at roughly 60 degrees, the Velhari position that meant, "I am required to give you this opportunity, and I would like you to know I am aware it may not end well for anyone." "The observer delegation has the floor," Morris said, briefly. Aris had been writing in her ledger the entire time Veloc was speaking. She did not stop immediately when Morris spoke. She finished the line she was on. Ren watched her hand make 3 more small, deliberate marks, and then she capped her pen. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be brief." She stood. She was, from Ren's elevated position at the verification console, visibly the smallest person on the floor. The gravitational dampeners at her tier were neutral, which meant they did nothing for her posture, her voice projection, or the perceived size of her presence. She stood in the exact center of her assigned space with the ledger open in one hand and looked at the central data stream. "Subdirector Veloc has proposed a 37% corridor maintenance tariff," she said. "He's grounded this proposal in the Crinian hegemony's freight volume projections for the next 30 years. I'd like to examine how those projections were calculated because I think the method has a problem. She touched a panel on her desk with her free hand. Her observer access privileges were limited. She couldn't push directly to the main data stream, but she had requested, during intake 3 days ago, the ability to submit queries to Wren's verification console for secondary display. He had approved it as a standard observer accommodation. His console lit up. She had submitted a single equation. Wren looked at it. His optical clusters ran it twice automatically because that was what they did with anything that flagged an internal inconsistency. The equation ran. The equation produced a result. The result contradicted the volume on slide 4 of Veiloc's proposal by a factor of roughly 2.5. He did not say anything. His job was to verify, not to interpret. He logged it. The hegemony's model, Aris continued, uses a linear freight volume progression, constant growth rate over the projection window. This is a reasonable model in stable corridor conditions. She turned a page in her ledger. It is not a reasonable model in the Veth nebula boundary zones, which cover 11 of the 14 primary corridors in this amendment. Nebula boundary freight behaves nonlinearly. It follows the 8th harmonic integer pattern documented in the Solhari correction, specifically in Volume 3, Chapter 41, which Subdirector Veiloc referenced as a 700-page document. She looked up. It is, in fact, 912 pages. Volume 3 begins on page 431. 3 of the specialists in Veiloc's own entourage were now looking at their handheld consoles. Veiloc's dermal plating had gone to a shade of blue-black that Wren associated, from experience, with a Crinian who was choosing between 2 responses and had not yet decided which would serve him better. The point, he said, and his voice had taken on a particular quality of deliberate patience, the kind a person used when they were being patient at someone rather than with them, is that the Solhari correction remains subject to interpretive variance. Qualified scholars disagree on its application to the maintenance rate framework. Legacy deference allows the hegemony to use its own established methodology. Legacy deference allows you to use your own methodology, Aris agreed. It doesn't require the rest of the Concordat to accept a methodology that produces corridor collapse projections in a nebula zone. She said it the way someone might agree that yes, you are allowed to use a map, while noting that the map shows a road through a building. She sat back down. She opened her ledger again. If it would help, I can walk through the 8th harmonic correction on lines 70 through 89. It takes about 12 minutes. Veiloc said, this is a transparent attempt to delay a legitimate vote. You're right that it will take 12 minutes, Aris said. We can do it now, or we can do it after the vote fails on implementation review in 6 months. I find now is usually faster. Wren's console registered 2 more query submissions from her terminal. He ran them both. The first corrected Veiloc's freight density estimate for the outer Veth zone. The second showed what happened to the 37% tariff rate when you applied the corrected freight density. The revenue it was supposed to generate dropped by almost half, which meant the maintenance fee justification collapsed entirely, because the fee would now exceed the projected maintenance cost by more than the freight revenue it was supposed to cover. He logged both. His fingers stayed very still on the console surface. The amendment, he realized, did not work. Not because of a technicality, not because of interpretive variance, because the math at its foundation was wrong, and the wrong math was not an accident. Linear progression was not a mistake a trade scholar made in a nebula zone, not in the 223rd year of the Crinian hegemony's operation in those same corridors. They had been running those routes since before Wren was born. They knew what the 8th harmonic did to their projections. They had known for 2 centuries. He did not say this. He logged his results and kept his face neutral and watched Veiloc. Veiloc called for a procedural recess. The recess lasted 20 minutes. Wren used it to run a full secondary sweep of all 3 of Veiloc's holographic arrays, not because anything had triggered his tamper protocols, but because the first sweep had been routine and something in him, the part trained to notice wrong details, wanted to look again. The sweep returned clean. He filed a note in his log. Arrays rechecked, clean, anomalous internal data routing on array 2 consistent with standard Crinian display architecture. He almost deleted the note because it said nothing. He kept it because the alternative was deleting a detail he'd noticed, and he had a rule about that. When the session reconvened, Veiloc's entourage had condensed. 3 of the 9 aides had left. The ones who remained were clustered around the primary array, speaking in low frequencies that Wren's audio pickup couldn't resolve. Veiloc stood at the top tier with the composed stillness of a man who had decided on his response and was waiting for the correct moment to deploy it. He introduced, as a supplement to his original proposal, what he called classified supporting documentation. He had pre-filed it with the Concordats document registry 48 hours ago. Wren found the timestamp in the system when he ran the receipt check, which meant it was admissible without a review period. The documentation ran to another 89 pages. It appeared in the central data stream as a sealed file, its contents now unlocked and spreading across the display column in a cascade of trade records, historical freight agreements, and what the file header described as verified precedent citations. Veiloc said, "The hegemony's methodology is supported by precedent, 23 independent citations, all verified. This matter is now settled." Wren began running citation checks. It was standard procedure. The system pulled each citation and confirmed it against the Concordats reference archive. He expected it to take 4 minutes. He had done this in his sleep. The first citation came back clean. The third citation came back clean. The 7th citation flagged. His clusters twitched. He ran it again. The flag held. The cited work existed, a freight analysis by a trade scholar named Vane, dated 260 years ago, but the specific finding Veiloc had attributed to it did not appear anywhere in the document. The attribution was precise, a specific quote, a specific page number, a specific conclusion. None of it was in the source. He kept running. He did not stop at 7. He ran all 23. 14 came back with varying degrees of the same problem. The cited works existed. The citations themselves did not match what the cited works said. He sat with this for a moment. Then he quietly sent a status flag to his supervisor's console, a yellow-level advisory, not a full lock, not yet, and looked at the floor. Aris had not looked up from her ledger during the recess. She had not looked up when the supplemental documentation hit the data stream. She was writing. She filled a page, turned to the next one. Her pen moved at a pace that suggested she was not taking notes on what Veiloc was saying. She was working from something she already had. Veiloc had turned back to the presiding officer. He was building toward the vote again, citing the volume of supporting evidence, citing legacy deference, citing the precedent of closed deliberation on documentation of this sensitivity. He was very good at this. The wall of words he built was designed to be exactly as tall as the patience of any delegate willing to argue with it. In Wren's experience, that wall won most of the time, because most of the time the room ran out of patience before it ran out of wall. Aris set her pen down. She raised her hand, the small, flat gesture of a person requesting the floor in an institution where she had been told twice that her floor time was provisional. Morris looked at her. His crest feathers were now at 45 degrees, which in Wren's experience meant something between "I did not expect this" and "I am not going to stop it." "Dr. Thorne," he said. "I have a question about the citations," she said. She didn't wait for anyone to agree that citations were worth questioning. She opened her ledger to a page roughly a third of the way through, held it up so the nearest delegates could see it was handwritten, and said, "Citation 7. Subdirector Veiloc attributes a specific finding to a freight analysis by a scholar named Vane, the conclusion that nebula boundary corridors demonstrate stable linear volume behavior over 2-century windows. I'd like to ask Security Adjudicator Wren to display the full text of that citation on secondary screen." Every head in the chamber turned to Wren's console, including Veiloc's. Wren had the citation open. He had been staring at it for 4 minutes. He pushed it to secondary display without comment because that was his job, and because his job was the only thing he trusted himself to do right now. The vein analysis filled the secondary column, 340 words. A trade study from 260 years ago, archived in the Concordat's reference library since before the Crinean hegemony had proposed its first corridor agreement. It said nothing about linear volume behavior. It said the opposite. Its central finding, clearly stated in the abstract, then again in the conclusion, in language that required no interpretive variance whatsoever, was that nebular boundary freight showed strongly nonlinear behavior and that any model treating it as linear would. And here it used a technical term that translated roughly as catastrophically wrong, produce results that were catastrophically wrong. The chamber read it. Veylock read it. Aris said, Citation 7 appears to contradict the conclusion subdirector Veylock attributed to it. Shall we check Citation 8? There are moments, Wren thought, when a room changes its nature, not its shape or its acoustics. Its nature, the thing it is doing, and the direction it is doing it in. For the last 2 hours, this room had been a chamber where a trade amendment was being passed. Now it was something else. He could feel the change the way you felt a gravitational dampener shift pitch, not loudly, just a new weight in the air, a recalibration of what was up. He checked Citation 8. He pushed it to secondary display. It supported Veylock's claim about as well as the vein analysis had. Aris moved through them methodically. She did not hurry, she did not editorialize. She said, citation number, attributed claim, and then she waited for Wren to put the source on screen, and the source said what it said, and the room absorbed it one citation at a time. Some held up, several did not. A Pelhari delegate 3 tiers up, a senior economist, Wren noted from his intake records, with 40 years in freight modeling, had taken out a physical notepad and was drawing a column of marks. 1 mark per citation. A second column beside it for the ones that failed. He was on his 14th mark in the second column when Veylock's vents snapped shut. This proceeding, Veylock said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which in Wren's experience was considerably more alarming than when it was loud, is being deliberately weaponized. The observer delegation is conducting a procedural obstruction disguised as academic review. I move that the floor be returned to the primary presenter and the vote proceed under legacy deference. The Pelhari economist put his 14th mark in the second column. Morris looked between them. His crest feathers had gone to a position Wren had never seen them in before, tilted roughly 30 degrees to the left, which was not a standard Velhari authority gesture. He thought it might be the Velhari equivalent of a person who had walked into a room expecting to moderate a discussion, and now realized they were chairing something else entirely. The observer delegation retains the floor, Morris said, pending completion of the citation review. Veylock said nothing. He said nothing for 11 minutes, which was how long it took Aris to work through the remaining citations at her methodical pace. Not all of them were wrong. Wren's count matched hers when she reached the end. 9 of the 23 held up under direct comparison. The other 14 did not. Some were misattributed. Some were fabrications with no matching source document in the archive, and 2 cited scholars who, when Wren pulled their registry entries, had been dead for longer than some of the species in this chamber had been spacefaring. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at the data stream. For the record, she said, I count 14 citations that don't support what they claim to support, and 2 that reference individuals who are no longer in a position to clarify their findings. I want to be fair to the subdirector. 9 of his 23 citations are accurate, which is a meaningful portion. She paused. It's just not a sufficient portion to constitute verified precedent for a 37% tariff affecting 11 species. The Pelhari economist put his notepad away. Veylock stood very still at his podium. Then he did something Wren had not predicted. He smiled, not with warmth, with the particular quality of composure a person deployed when they had decided that the game they were losing was not the real game. The hegemony, he said, accepts that citation discrepancies have been identified. We attribute them to translation errors in the archive transfer process, for which we will file a correction. He was already touching his primary array. However, the amendment's foundation is not the citations. The citations are supplementary. The foundation is our proprietary operational data, 200 years of actual corridor records. That data is now being submitted to the data stream directly. He looked at Aris. The look was very calm. Analog notation cannot contest live operational records. The main data stream shifted. New records cascaded into the display column: freight logs, route records, volume histories, maintenance expenditure data. Dense, professional, exactly the kind of granular operational evidence that was nearly impossible to challenge in real time without equivalent access. The vote, Velox said, should proceed. Wren watched the data stream. Something was wrong with it, not obviously wrong, not in the way the citations had been wrong, cleanly and demonstrably wrong. This was a different kind of wrong, the kind that registered in his clusters not as a flag, but as an itch. The data was internally consistent, too consistent. 200 years of freight operation in nebula boundary zones always had variants, mechanical failures, rerouting events, whether analogs in the nebula systems, the natural noise of real operational records. What was on screen had almost none. It was very clean, beautifully clean. He began pulling spot comparisons against the Concordat's own route monitoring records from the same corridors, which he had access to as adjudicator. The comparison took 90 seconds. When it finished, his optical clusters went completely still. He had never had them do that before. The Concordat's own route data, the independent record, logged automatically by the relay station the hub sat above, showed different numbers for the same corridors over the same period. Not slightly different, significantly different in ways that changed the freight volume picture fundamentally enough that the 37% tariff would have been, by any reasonable methodology, unjustifiable. He sat with this for a moment. His yellow advisory was still sitting in his supervisor's queue. He had sent it 8 minutes ago. No response. Below him, Aris Thorne had not looked at the main data stream since Velox's operational records began loading. She had looked at her ledger. She was checking something, running her finger down a column of handwritten figures. Her expression was the same expression it had been for the last 2 hours, not tense, not alarmed, not uncertain. The expression of someone working through a familiar type of problem at a familiar pace. She reached the bottom of the column. She stopped. She looked up at the data stream for the first time in 4 minutes. Then she looked at her ledger again, then at the stream. She picked up her pen and wrote one short note in the margin. Then she capped the pen. Then she went to the small carafe of water on her desk, a standard provision at every delegate station, water in a plain ceramic vessel, and poured herself a half cup. She did not drink it. She set the cup down to the left of her ledger. Her hand was entirely steady. Then she raised her hand. "Presiding Officer Morris," she said, "I need to flag a data integrity concern." Velox's smile thinned to a line. "Subdirector Velox live operational data," Aris said, and she was addressing Morris, but angled toward Wren's console, not toward the main stream, appears to have been altered. The word altered landed in the chamber the way a flat stone lands on still water. The sound was small, the ring was not. "That is," Velox said, and his voice had gone very quiet again, quieter than before, "an extraordinary accusation." "Yes," Aris said, "I'd like to explain it." She opened her ledger to the column she'd been checking. "The Hegemony's operational data is showing me average freight volumes for the outer Veth corridors. The numbers on screen are in conflict with the figures I entered in this ledger 3 days ago when I pulled the same corridors from the Concordat's public route monitoring database during intake review." She held the ledger up, not theatrically, just so the nearest delegates could see it. "My numbers are ink, they can't be changed. The screen can." No one spoke. "I would ask Security Adjudicator Wren," she said, still looking at Morris, "to run a comparison between the live data stream and the Concordat's own route monitoring archive." Wren was already looking at his screen. He had run it 90 seconds ago. He pushed the comparison to the main display column. both sets of numbers side by side, Velox's live feed and the Concordat's independent relay log from the same corridors over the same period. He did not annotate it, he did not editorialize. He pushed it to the center of the room and let the room read it. The differences were not subtle. Across the chamber, the sound of delegates beginning to talk built slowly, like a change in air pressure. The Pelhari economist had taken his notepad back out. Two Velhari junior delegates were showing their screens to each other. One of the delegates from the species furthest in debt to the hegemony corridor system, a small bipedal species called the Heathran, who stood in a cluster near the lower tier, had gone very still. Velox looked at the comparison on the main display for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Aris. Then he looked at his primary array. The discrepancy, he said, is the result of a calibration difference between the relay monitoring format and the hegemony's internal logging standard, a known variance. Our technical team can produce documentation. When Aris asked, "In due course. The vote is in 20 minutes. Our technical team," Velox said, "can produce documentation." Aris picked up her half cup of water. She did not drink it. She held it for a moment, the way a person held something when they needed their hands to be occupied and not doing anything else. Then she set it back down. "The reason my figures and the current data stream disagree," she said, "is not a calibration variance." She looked at Array 2, directly at it, the middle of the 3 Velox had positioned at the session's opening. It's because Subdirector Velox Podium is running a live digital rewrite of the archive through his primary display array. She looked at Ren. "I think your intake sweep of the arrays flagged an anomaly in Array 2's internal data routing. I think it was logged as consistent with standard display architecture." She paused. "It isn't." Ren's hands went to his console. The anomaly in Array 2, the note he had almost deleted, the thing he had logged because he had a rule about details he noticed, came up on his screen. He pulled the routing architecture that had been logged as standard. He ran it against the Crinian hegemony's certified display specifications, which were on file with the Concordat. The routing pattern was not consistent with any certified Crinian display architecture. It was consistent with an active data rewrite tool, the kind that could reach the hub's live data stream and make changes to the archive as it rendered in real time, so that what appeared on screen was not what was in the archive, but what the rewrite tool said was in the archive. He looked at the data stream. He looked at his independent root logs. He ran the lock protocol. Velox's arrays went dark. All 3 of them. The holographic scaffold he had spent 40 minutes building at the session's opening collapsed into the ambient light of the chamber. The data stream snapped back to its baseline state, the Concordat's own records, unmodified, showing exactly what the relay logs showed, which was not what Velox's operational data had shown. The difference was visible to everyone in the room. Velox said, "You have no authority to." "Verification lock," Ren said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "Protocol 7, active data manipulation during an open session. Subdirector Velox terminal access is suspended pending investigation." The lock sound was not loud. A single terminal tone, flat, procedural, and then Velox's 3 arrays went dark in sequence. The holographic scaffold he had spent 40 minutes constructing collapsed inward and disappeared, and the data stream snapped back to its baseline state. The Concordat's own relay logs filled the display column. Real numbers, unchanged. The freight volumes for the outer Veth corridors as they had actually been for 200 years, sitting beside what Velox's live feed had been showing. The difference was not subtle. 412 delegates read both columns simultaneously. The chamber did not erupt. It settled, the slow, distributed shift of a structure losing its load-bearing center. 37 conversations began at once. The Pelhari economist, 3 tiers up, stopped writing his tally and stared at the comparison with the expression of a man confirming arithmetic he already knew the answer to. The Heathran cluster near the lower tier pressed together instinctively. Velox's 6 remaining aides pulled back from the dark space where the arrays had been, and began calculating distance to the exits. Veloc himself had not moved. His dampeners were still working. His posture was still amplified. His dermal plating had gone so dark it was nearly absorbing light rather than catching it, and his secondary vents, the display organs that had been cycling and flaring for the entire session, had gone completely still. "You have no authority to," he began. "Verification lock," Wren said. "Protocol 7, active data manipulation during an open session. Subdirector Veloc's terminal access is suspended pending investigation." He heard his own voice come out flat and technical and entirely steady, which surprised him because his optical clusters had done something they had never done before. Not twitching, not scanning. Simply stopped, fixed on the comparison he had pushed to the main display, both sets of numbers still visible, still different, the difference still there for anyone who wanted to read it. He thought about the note he had almost deleted. "The data manipulation field," Aris said, from her mid-tier desk, without looking up from her ledger, "has been active since the supplemental documentation was submitted. Array 2's routing architecture was logging writes to the live archive at approximately 1 modification per 8 seconds. Over 43 minutes, that is approximately 322 individual alterations to the displayed data." She turned a page. "What was on screen was not an archive," she said. "It was a live composition, being composed in real time to produce a freight volume picture that would justify a 37% tariff rate." She looked up. "That's what I wanted to flag as a data integrity concern." Veloc said, "That is an extraordinary accusation." "Yes," Aris said, "which is why I'd like to walk through the citations again." The stillness that followed was a different quality than before. Not shock, something closer to a room that had heard a sentence and was processing which direction it was pointing. Veloc's vents opened, closed, opened again. "The citations have been addressed. The 14 inaccurate ones have been noted," Aris said. "I'd like to discuss where they came from." She had turned to a section near the back of her ledger, pages dense with smaller handwriting, clearly written before the session, before Veloc's supplemental documentation had appeared. Citation 16 attributes a finding to a Dr. Seville Oren, identified as a senior freight economist, date of publication 312 years ago. She looked at Wren. He pulled the registry. He found the entry. He pushed it to secondary display without speaking, because his voice was doing something he did not entirely trust. Seville Oren had died 314 years ago. The publication attributed to Oren had been authored approximately 2 years after Oren's death, which meant it had not been authored by Oren, which meant it was not a translation error or a calibration variance. It was a document that did not exist, attributed to a person who had not been alive to write it. The Pelhari economist made a sound his translator rendered as a very short, involuntary exhale. Citation 21, Aris continued, turning a page, attributes a finding to a freight consortium called the Veth Boundary Collective. She waited for Wren to pull the registry. The Veth Boundary Collective had been registered for 11 years. The citation attributed to it was dated 163 years ago. "I have 47 entries," Aris said, "not all in the citations, some in the underlying methodology documentation filed with intake 2 days ago, which I reviewed during the intake period." She touched the ledger's spine. 47 instances of documentation attributed to sources that either do not exist, did not exist at the time of alleged publication, or contradict the findings attributed to them. She set the ledger flat on her desk. 14 of the 47 may be explained by archive error. The remaining 33 cannot, because the sources postdate the citations or say the opposite of what's attributed or don't exist. She pushed her glasses up. 33 fabrications is not a translation error, it's a methodology. Veloc said, "This is a coordinated attack on the Crinean hegemony." His voice had slipped out of the register it was supposed to stay in. What was underneath was not authority. It was the particular quality of panic that presents as aggression because aggression had always worked before. Earth has manufactured this. A species with 40 years of spaceflight, no established trade network, no corridor infrastructure. They have come to this session with a pre-built dossier designed to destroy a 200-year institution. I would ask the presiding officer to consider who benefits from the dismantling of hegemony, trade, authority. He was breathing through his vents, fast, uncontrolled. Presiding officer Morris's crest feathers went to straight vertical. Subdirector Vaylock, he said, the floor record shows detected active data manipulation. 14 of 23 citations did not support attributed findings. The discrepancy between submitted operational data and the Concordat's independent relay archive is consistent with real-time alteration via a non-certified routing tool. He paused. The observer delegation has presented evidence. The presiding officer is required to follow the evidence. Vaylock said, the observer delegation is. The floor, Morris said, is with the observer delegation. Aris had opened her ledger again, not to a new page, back to the column of freight figures she had written 3 days ago during intake review. Subdirector Vaylock is right that someone benefits from the current review, she said. The chamber looked at her. 11 species benefit. The 11 species facing a 37% corridor tariff that would have reached resource-critical status for 4 of them within 8 years. She didn't look up. I want to be specific about that because specific numbers are more useful than general characterizations of political maneuvering. She looked up at the room, all of it. The Crinian hegemony's corridor infrastructure is real. The stabilization work in the outer systems is real. The freight network that kept 8 species from resource collapse is a genuine contribution to Concordat stability, and the real record reflects that. She paused. What is also real is that a 37% exploitation tariff built on fabricated precedent and manipulated operational data is not a maintenance fee. She closed the ledger. I don't have anything further to add to the citation review. Adjudicator Wren's record is complete. She picked up her pen, capped it, set it beside the ledger. I believe there are 291 pages of the original amendment that haven't been reviewed yet, if the chamber wants to continue. She pulled her water cup toward her and drank what was left of it. Vaylock's voice, when it finally came, had the quality of a person speaking through an architecture that had stopped holding. 200 years, he said. The hegemony has maintained these corridors for 200 years. We have built the infrastructure that keeps 11 emerging species alive in the outer systems. We have absorbed the costs that should have been shared. Yes, Aris said. Vaylock stopped. All of that is true, she said. The audit will confirm it. She pushed her glasses up. The audit will also confirm the 33 fabrications and 322 real-time archive alterations. Both things are in the record now. She looked back at her ledger. What happens with the rest of the hegemony's trade relationship is not a question I'm positioned to answer. That's a much longer process. But this amendment isn't going to pass tonight. Vaylock looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the podium. His 6 remaining aides converged. They moved toward the tier steps in silence, and the chamber let them go in silence, which was its own kind of statement, not the formal quiet of a procedural moment, but the instinctive uncertainty of a room watching something happen and not yet having a category for it. Wren watched them go. He logged the departure timestamp. He logged the credential suspension. He logged everything that had a category. Then he entered his final note to the session record. Discrepancy identified via comparison between live data stream and independent analog record maintained by observer delegation. Analog record immune to active data rewrite tool due to non-digital medium. Cross-reference validated. Lock initiated. He looked at the sentence for a moment. Analog record immune. From somewhere on the lower tier, a Heathran delegate said quietly, not intended for the floor, "How long has she known?" Wren did not look up. 3 days, he thought, since intake, since she wrote those figures in ink. He looked at Aris. She had opened her ledger to a fresh page and was writing again, unhurried, in the same even hand she had used all session. She had built a case for 47 fabrications, traced a data manipulation tool through 3 display arrays, and when she was finished, she had offered to review the remaining 291 pages. Not as a threat, as a logistical option. He thought she pulled her strike. She had enough in that ledger to have been worse. She had chosen, at every point, the form of the demonstration that was complete rather than excessive. The room, he thought, would be living with that choice for a long time. Not with the explosion, with the measurement.